Welcome back to Real News. We're talking to former Senator Thomas Coburn of Oklahoma. Senator Coburn was a practicing physician, and he had a real life. He had a real career. He went for 3 terms as a congressman to Washington, and as he'd promised people, he stepped down after 3 terms, went back to his practice, and then after a few years, he got elected to the U.S. Senate. And he served 1 term, got reelected a 2nd time, but then he didn't fulfill that entire time. He retired early, and now he's written several books about what is wrong with Washington and offers some solutions. So I want to get back to Senator Coburn, and I want to hear some solutions. Of course, we know what the problem is. The key problem are career politicians, people who are not like Senator Coburn, people who have all their life wanted to be a politician. They don't want to do anything other than be a politician. They don't have a life outside of Washington. That is a prescription for disaster. How do we fix that, Senator Coburn?
Well, in the Constitutional Convention in the late 1700s, George Mason stood up about halfway through it and asked everybody if they hadn't made a grievous error. And everybody kind of looked at him funny, and he said, "Do you know any time in history where a government has voluntarily ceded power back to the people it governs?" And of course, yes, nobody could name that. That's never happened. So they put in Article 5 originally, where only the states could amend the Constitution by offering amendments. They later allowed the Congress to do that. So the answer to our problems today, if you ask the question, why isn't somebody working on the budget as far as balancing it? Why isn't somebody working on the debt? Why isn't somebody working to solve the problems with Social Security and Medicare? The reason is because all those things, and the $400 billion a year in just total stupidity and waste, all those things have a constituency. So rather than do what's best for our country, like their oath would imply they should do, they do what's best for their political careers. And if you look at the Senate, 65 senators have never had a real job. So it's not unreasonable to think that they don't have the backbone that's required to be visionary leaders and make hard choices. So the way we change it is through an Article 5 Convention of the States. We're sponsoring. We have 12 states that have passed it. We have 1.3 million volunteers. And what it says is there ought to be a fiscal responsibility, which would imply a balanced budget amendment with general accepted accounting principles. You cannot trust what the government tells you when it comes to numbers. I can tell you that. And number 2, there ought to be a limitation on the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government, like the enumerated powers, which was in the original Constitution, has been butchered by the courts and the executive branch. And number 3, there ought to be term limits on both appointed and elected officials. The average length a judge served the first 180 years of our country was 6 years. It's now 20 plus some. So they lose contact, they lose context, and so do our politicians. So I ran because I wasn't a politician. I thought people other than politicians ought to be involved in this. And we have some good people that aren't politicians that are there. So it's not about not trying to send better people there. It's about trying to fix the real problems, the real disease, not treat the symptoms. And what you've seen Congress do all this year is treat symptoms of disease rather than fix the real problems.
Well, I absolutely agree. And I think when you talk about term limits on appointed officials, especially in the judiciary, I think that is a big deal. And when we talk about term limits, we just typically think about those people who are elected. But what about the people who weren't elected, people who were appointed? But the question I have with this is that, we look at this and we've got things like the 9th and 10th Amendment. You're talking about keeping government within the scope of the Constitution. We have the Constitution that would restrict things like that. And I understand that it's the activist Supreme Court that gets around that. But if we can't get these people to follow this Constitution, we're running a bit of a risk, aren't we? Running an Article 5 Constitution that we don't really know if it's going to be, if we can keep it to a couple of different focused topics. And we don't really have anybody in Washington that really pays any attention to the Constitution anyway, do we? I mean, how do we enforce even what we have now? Because if we would enforce what we have now with the 9th and 10th Amendment, that would shut down most of what is being done. And it seems to me, just one other thing to throw in here, and you can comment on whatever you want, but the idea that we have turned over most of the lawmaking capacity to an unelected permanent bureaucracy that is really writing the laws. And Senator Paul has talked about that in his REINS Act, saying we got to make Congress take back what they have abdicated to the permanent established bureaucracy there.
Well, first of all, the annotated Constitution weighs 82 pounds. It's not like the little book that's in your pocket. And what I would put forward to you is most of the members of Congress are actually following that annotated Constitution. But the problem is that came about through both judges and bureaucrats and regulation, not Congress. And Congress has ceded its power. So the whole idea of Article 5, there's no risk in an Article 5. There's a risk in not doing an Article 5 Amendments Convention, because we will continue to do what we're doing now, which is going down the tubes. So what I would put forward to you is, if we in fact limit the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government, we will renew the enumerated powers and the 9th and 10th Amendment. We will eliminate the expansive Commerce Clause, which allows them to step all over the enumerated powers. If we limit their terms, they will actually start thinking about what they were there for instead of their political careers. And finally, if we make them be fiscally responsible, where they have to make hard choices, which they don't today. They won't make hard choices. You just saw that. The first 9 months of this year, they refused to make hard choices because it might impact their political career. So it's about the politicians and not us. The key thing is Washington's telling Americans what to do right now rather than Americans telling Washington what to do. And if we're truly a country of a republic of the people, by the people, and for the people, what we will do is use this amendments convention to rebalance the relationship between the states and federal government, have true federalism, and rebalance the relationship between the three branches of the federal government. If we do that, what I see is a bright future, and we will force our elected officials to make the hard choices. You know, what we lack right now is visionary leadership. We don't have it in the Senate, and we don't have much of it in the House. And what we need is somebody that'll pull our country together, call us to sacrifice, because our country became great through sacrifice. It wasn't by sitting back complaining, and activism that allows us to do what is necessary to protect the future for our kids.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think the American public just wants comfort and safety. They don't want freedom, and they don't want the sacrifice that is required to have freedom. Let me ask you, because you correctly pointed out the Commerce Clause is the means by which they have expanded the government into basically everything. But, you know, when we look at something like the drug war, for example, or, you know, we had the Commerce Clause, and then we did have an annotation to the Commerce Clause to the existing Constitution with the 9th and 10th Amendment. And even when we had alcohol prohibition, we had a constitutional amendment for that. But then when we go to general drug prohibition, they say, well, we've got the Commerce Clause. I don't understand the sequence there. I mean, if we've got an annotated Constitution that takes that out, why is the Commerce Clause now trumping the 9th and 10th Amendment?
Well, it's not in terms of drug usage. You got Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Nevada. Yes. All these states have passed the marijuana, which is still total on the books. It's a felony.
Yes.
Right.
And so that's an example of state nullification. Yes. That's right. So what they've said is no, and the federal government says we're not going to challenge that. So but that's a symptom of the problem. The real problem is the federal government hadn't followed a limited government role and allowed decision makings to be made in the states. And so what I would put forward to you is a lot of the controversy and division in our country came about because the federal government made decisions that weren't right for every state, and that the states didn't get a chance to make the decisions for themselves, whether it's marriage or drugs or whatever it is. They created the oppositional forces that we now see battling on social issues. And we shouldn't have that. And it wouldn't have happened if the federal government was in its limited role. Very interesting to talk to you. We're out of time. Thank you, Senator Coburn. And again, you can find his new book, Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom to Stop America's Runaway Government. You can find that on WND. And if you want to talk about somebody who is not a career politician, somebody who is a citizen who went to Congress and then went back to private life, he is a prime example of that. Senator Thomas Coburn, thank you for joining us.
Sign the petition at cosaction.com and get as many of your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you, so we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.